The first sound Jack Hale heard that morning was the sound of silence. Not the quiet kind, the heavy kind. The kind that presses against your chest, fills the cracks in your head, and leaves no room for anything else. The world outside the truck's fogged windows was gray, damp, and still. Boone lay curled in the passenger seat, his brown and black coat damp from last night's rain, one ear twitching with every distant sound from the empty rest stop. Jack stared at the condensation on the windshield, tracing it with his thumb, like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew. The verdict had come months ago. This cold truck, this silence was just the sentence. His breath came out in white puffs. October in North Carolina was never this cold in the city. But this wasn't Charlotte anymore. This was nowhere. The kind of nowhere where no one cared that your construction company used to be in trade magazines or that you used to wear $1,000 suits. Boone lifted his head, brown eyes locked on Jack as if reading the storm behind his blank stare. "Yeah," Jack muttered, rubbing his face. "I know, buddy. I know." He reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out the folded letter. He didn't need to open it. He'd memorized every line. "Jack, I can't keep doing this. I can't live like this. I hope you find something out there. I'm done trying. Melissa." No anger. No goodbye. Just the same practical tone she used to order takeout. The house had gone 2 weeks later. The company before that. The life they'd built, mortgaged, leveraged, then stripped bare, was auctioned off in pieces. When the lawyers stopped calling, when the friends stopped texting, all that remained was Boone, the old pickup, and this silence. A gust of wind rattled the cracked side mirror. Boone sat up, alert now. He'd always sensed when Jack's mind started sinking too deep. The dog nudged his arm, insistent, solid, a reminder that something still tethered him to the world. Jack swallowed hard. "We're still here, huh?" he whispered. The words tasted bitter. Still here wasn't exactly victory. 6 months earlier, he'd stood in front of a massive, unfinished steel skeleton blueprints clutched in his hand, telling investors that their luxury mountain resort would be the crown jewel of the Blue Ridge. He'd believed it. Maybe that was the real joke. The investors' funding had vanished overnight, along with every cent Jack had poured into the project. The lawsuits followed. So did the foreclosure notices. The day the sheriff taped the bright orange paper to his front door, Melissa hadn't cried. She just folded her arms and said, "I can't be here for the wreck." And she left. The silence then had been different. Louder, sharper. Jack cracked open the truck door, the metal groaning, like it was as tired as he was. Cold air cut through his hoodie, knifing against his skin. The rest stop was empty, except for a busted vending machine and the smell of wet asphalt. He leaned against the hood and lit a cigarette, though he'd promised himself he'd quit months ago. Promises didn't mean much when everything else was already broken. Boone jumped down after him, paws splashing in puddles, nose to the wind. Jack watched him trot to the edge of the woods, tail wagging, like there was still something worth finding out there. "Wish I had your optimism," Jack muttered. He exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the cold morning air. It had been 3 weeks since the foreclosure. 3 weeks of parking lots and truck stops. He'd driven aimlessly, refusing to call his sister in Atlanta or his brother in Nashville. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to explain. How do you tell people the man who once gave them business advice was now eating gas station sandwiches and sleeping next to a dog in a rusted Ford? A low rumble of distant thunder rolled through the mountains. Rain again. Boone came running back, ears perked, his entire body humming with alertness. And then it happened. The wind shifted, carrying a smell Jack hadn't expected, a sharp, earthy scent. familiar but long buried under years of drywall dust and espresso shots. It smelled like pine needles and damp bark. It smelled like the mountains. Something flickered behind his ribs. A memory. A voice rough and steady like old gravel. If a man ever needs to disappear, Jackie boy, the mountains won't ask him why. But they'll make him earn the right to stay. His grandfather. Summer afternoons on the porch. Stories about the family hunting cabin tucked somewhere deep in the Blue Ridge left to rot after the last winter they'd used it. He hadn't thought of that cabin in years. Jack flicked the cigarette away, crushing the ember beneath his boot. Boone tilted his head as if to ask, what now? What now? The question had been hanging over him for months. No money, no home, no plan. But for the first time in a long time, the question didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a door. He climbed back into the truck and opened the cracked center console. Old receipts, a half-empty lighter, a forgotten map folded so many times the creases had started to split. He smoothed it out on the dashboard. Blue Ridge Mountains stretched across it like a promise too big to make sense. He traced the ridgeline with his finger, following the faint marker his grandfather had once drawn. A red X near a place he'd called Ridge Hollow. God, he couldn't even remember the last time he'd been near there. Boone jumped back into the passenger seat, tail thumping against the door panel. Jack laughed, the sound hoarse from disuse. Yeah. Don't get too excited. It's just a stupid idea, he said. But his voice carried a little more breath than before. He turned the key. The old engine coughed, then caught. A shaky rhythm like a heart learning to beat again. As the truck rolled back onto the empty highway, the first drops of rain started to fall. Boone rested his head on Jack's knee, the steady warmth grounding him. The wipers groaned back and forth. Mile markers slid by one after another as the city behind them disappeared into a smear of wet gray. The radio was dead, so the only sounds were rain and engine. Jack liked it that way. Words had failed him too many times lately. This is insane, a part of him whispered. You don't even know if that cabin is still standing. Yeah, another part answered. But at least it's somewhere. The somewhere felt like enough. They stopped once for gas in a small town, whose name Jack didn't catch. An old man behind the counter eyed Boone with a smile and asked hunting season. Jack shook his head. Not exactly. The man nodded like he understood anyway. Mountain people had a way of not asking too much. Back on the road, the terrain began to change. Pines thickened. The curves grew sharper, wilder. The old Ford struggled on steep climbs, its engine growling with the effort. But Jack kept going. For the first time in months, he wasn't driving away from something. He was driving toward something, no matter how broken it might be when he got there. As twilight bled into the forest, the fog rolled in thick, wrapping the mountain in a gray shroud. Boone lifted his head, ears twitching at sounds Jack couldn't hear. Branches scraped the roof of the truck like skeletal fingers. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Almost there, he said, though he didn't know if that was true. The dirt road narrowed until it was barely a trail. He had to stop twice to clear fallen branches with his bare hands, the wet bark freezing his fingers. The last turn opened onto a small clearing overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. And there, half swallowed by trees, stood the cabin, if you could call it that. The roof sagged. One wall was buckled inward. The porch looked like it might crumble under a squirrel. But the log structure, old hand-hewn timber, still stood. Defiant. Boone jumped out before the truck stopped nose-working overtime. Jack stepped into the clearing and just stood there listening to the wind thread through the pines. It was colder here. Wilder. Real. "This is it," Jack whispered. Boone barked once, short and certain, like he agreed. Jack looked up at the sagging roof, the broken windows, the vines crawling through the gaps. He saw rot. He saw ruin. But beneath that, beneath the failure, he saw possibility. He exhaled, slow and steady. "We're not leaving," he said softly, almost to himself. "Not yet." Far behind them, the city they'd abandoned was already forgetting their names. But here at the edge of the Blue Ridge, something ancient and quiet waited not to save Jack, but to see if he was worth saving. And for the first time since it all fell apart, Jack felt the faintest spark of something dangerously close to hope. The cabin looked worse in daylight. Morning sun pushed through the fog, revealing every flaw, every splintered board and collapsed gutter. The front porch had caved in completely on the left side. The windows were shattered, some missing entirely. The roofline dipped like a tired spine, barely holding up under its own weight. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, hands in his jacket pockets, Boone sniffing the wet grass around him. There were birds in the trees somewhere far above, but all Jack could hear was the creak of wind pressing through broken wood. He took a deep breath. It smelled like rot pine and something metallic, maybe rust, maybe memory. "Hell of a homecoming," he muttered. Boone padded toward the porch, ears twitching. Jack followed, stepping carefully around a fallen beam. The porch groaned beneath his boots, warning him it had one foot in the grave. He stopped at the front door, or what was left of it. The hinges were barely clinging on. The wood had split like dry paper. He pushed it open with one hand. It fell off entirely, clattering sideways into the cabin. Inside it was cold and shadowy. Dust danced in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the broken roof. There were remnants of old furniture, just shapes now. A stove rusted in the corner. Mouse droppings. Scratched wood. A shattered mirror leaned against the far wall, reflecting a man Jack barely recognized. He stepped inside anyway. The air smelled like history. He walked a slow circle around the main room. The place was small, just one open space with what might have once been a sleeping loft up above. The floor groaned. Some boards were soft underfoot. But the walls, the old logs, still looked solid, thick, heavy, cut by hand, not machines. Boone sat in the middle of the room, tail thumping once. The dog looked at Jack like, "Now what?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, took another long look at the wreck around him, and said it out loud this time. "Sometimes the road to nowhere is the only road left." He spent the rest of the morning outside, clearing what he could, pulling vines off the sides, stacking rotted boards, shoveling out moldy leaves that had drifted in through the broken windows. The sky stayed overcast, but the rain held off. Jack worked in silence, broken only by Boone's steady breathing as the dog explored the edge of the clearing like he was on patrol. Midday, he sat on the tailgate of the truck and ate the last of the gas station jerky. He shared the final strip with Boone, who took it gently, then licked Jack's hand like it meant more than food. The dog hadn't left his side since Melissa walked out. He watched the tree line for a while. The pines swayed. Farther up the slope, he could see bare patches of granite peeking through gray and massive like sleeping giants. It was quiet here, but not dead. That was the difference. In the city, silence had felt like a grave. Here it felt like an invitation. By late afternoon, he decided to check how far the road stretched past the cabin, if it could even be called a road anymore. The dirt trail that led in was barely wide enough for the truck and chewed up from years of erosion. He followed it on foot, Boone beside him, weaving through thick brush and ducking beneath low branches. Half a mile in the path disappeared completely under fallen trees and washed-out ground. No cell service, of course. No signs of life either. No cabins, no fences, nothing. just forest. They turned back. When they returned to the clearing, Jack spotted something he'd missed before a rusted horseshoe nailed above the doorframe, barely holding on, almost invisible beneath decades of grime. He reached up and pulled it down, turned it over in his hands. His grandfather must have hung it there. Guess we could use the luck, he said, slipping it into his jacket pocket. That night, he and Boone slept in the truck again. Jack didn't dare sleep inside the cabin yet, not until he was sure the floor wouldn't give out under him. The seats were stiff, but it beat motel parking lots and cheap cigarettes. He couldn't sleep. The wind kept brushing against the trees like an old tune with no melody. Boone snored softly. Jack stared through the windshield, watching mist rise from the grass in waves. He felt something inside him shift, not in a loud, dramatic way. It was subtle, like gears that had been jammed for months finally clicking into place. There was no one left to impress. No phone calls to return. No lawyers, no banks, no deadlines. Just him, Boone, and this broken thing that might be rebuilt. In the morning, he drove back down the mountain, heading to the nearest small town they'd passed through on the way up. It was called Lark Hollow, just a handful of buildings along a 2-lane road. A diner, a general store, a post office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. He found a hardware store with a rusted bell above the door that rang when he stepped inside. Behind the counter sat a wiry old man with sun-leathered skin and a gray beard that looked like it had survived a few wars. "You're not from around here," the man said without looking up. "Nope," Jack replied. "Mountain chewing you up yet?" "Not yet," Jack said. "But she's trying." The man snorted and finally looked at him. "Name's Tommy." "Jack." "What do you need?" Jack handed him a list. Plywood, nails, heavy-duty plastic tarp, rope, a hammer and gloves. Tommy scanned it. Cabin or grave? Jack smiled for the first time in days. Little bit of both, maybe. Tommy's eyes narrowed. Silver Ridge. You're not up that trail past the old ranger post near it. Well, I'll be damned. Ain't nobody stayed up there in, 30 years? It's still standing, Jack said. Barely, Tommy muttered. You got 4-wheel drive enough. You got any sense? Not much. Tommy gave a grunt that might have been a laugh. You'll fit in fine. Back up on the mountain, Jack hauled the supplies inside the cabin and set the tarp over the roof to keep out the next rain. He patched one window with plastic and a roll of duct tape. He covered a gaping hole in the floor with a plank and bricks from the collapsed chimney. It was ugly, but it was shelter. Boone watched from the corner tail wagging. By dusk, Jack sat on the porch, what was left of it, with a thermos of instant coffee. The wind had calmed. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was earned. The cabin still looked like hell, but so had he a week ago. Tomorrow he'd start tearing into the roof. He'd sketch out the bones, maybe even check if the creek down the ridge still flowed. He had no money left after the hardware store run. No food past tonight. No plan longer than a day. But he had the mountain, and Boone, and just enough fire in his gut to try again. A twig snapped in the trees. Boone's ears perked up. Jack turned. Something or someone was coming up the trail. He stood slowly, coffee forgotten, as Boone moved to his side. And in that moment, a thought whispered through his mind, loud and clear, if I can fix this roof, maybe I can fix myself. He stepped off the porch and into the trees. Whatever came next, he was ready to meet it. The figure who emerged from the trees was small and hunched, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that made Jack's hand twitch toward the knife in his coat pocket. Boone didn't bark. He just stood stiff and alert beside Jack, eyes trained on the stranger, like he already knew whether this person was a threat. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing, hands raised just enough to show they were empty. He wore a canvas jacket, jeans, crusted with dried mud, and a battered, wide-brimmed hat that looked like it had been through 2 wars and a forest fire. A canvas duffel was slung over one shoulder. "I ain't lost," the man called out, voice rough like gravel. "Just passing through." Jack didn't say anything yet. His heartbeat had slowed, but not by much. "You living up here?" the man asked after a moment, squinting toward the half-patched cabin. Jack nodded. "Trying." "Well," the man said, hitching the bag higher, "you got your work cut out for you." They talked on the porch. The stranger's name was Tommy Graves, same Tommy from the hardware store, though Jack barely recognized him without the counter in front of him. Apparently, Tommy hiked up here from town a couple times a year just to make sure the mountain's still here. This time, curiosity had dragged him the extra mile to see who was dumb enough to be fixing the ghost cabin. "You're not the first fool to come up here thinking he can outwork the mountain," Tommy said, sipping the instant coffee Jack had poured. "But you might be the first one with a real roof over his head by winter. If you don't kill yourself first." Jack smirked. That an offer to help Tommy laughed a dry rasp, like a handsaw through bone. "Hell no. I just came to see how bad it looked." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Boone had curled at Jack's feet, but his ears twitched every time Tommy shifted. "I saw what you hauled out of my shop," Tommy finally said. "You planning on patching that roof alone?" Jack shrugged. "Unless Boone figures out how to swing a hammer." Tommy grunted. "Then you better pray you got strong rafters left under all that rust." The next morning, Jack pulled the tarp aside and clamped onto the roof. He had no idea if the beams beneath him would hold, but they did barely. The ridge beam bowed like a tired back. Rusted nails poked up in all directions. Rot had eaten through the western edge, and one wrong step would send him crashing through into the cabin below. But still, he felt something like adrenaline buzz through him. Or maybe it was just the feeling of doing something real again. Something with weight. "If I can fix this roof," he muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow, "I can fix myself." The first nail was the hardest. Not because of the wood, it was still good once he scraped the moss and rot away. It was because of what it meant. Driving that nail in felt like crossing a line, like admitting he wanted to stay. That he hadn't just come up here to escape, but to rebuild. He paused, hammer raised, then brought it down in a sharp, solid strike. Boone barked below like it was a war cry. It took 2 days to strip the metal sheets off and assess the bones beneath. Jack worked sunrise to sundown, stopping only to drink water. Feed Boone. Or stretch the screaming ache out of his shoulders. He discovered 3 rotten rafters, 2 nests of wasps now very angry, and a mummified squirrel he decided not to think too much about. The local lumber yard in Lark Hollow cut new rafters for him. It ate the last of his emergency fund. Jack didn't care. The sound of new wood landing in the truck bed felt like progress, like maybe the mountain was meeting him halfway. That night, after another long shift, he sat on the porch again, drinking weak coffee and listening to the wind through the trees. Tommy showed up just before dark this time, carrying a small camping lantern and a bag of jerky. "Figured you'd forget to eat," he said, tossing it toward Jack. "You always show up without warning. Mountain people don't knock." They ate in silence, Boone eyeing Tommy the entire time, but no longer growling. "You ever build something from nothing?" Jack asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Tommy didn't answer right away. "Then built a house for my girl once. Thought it'd fix what was broken between us." "Did it?" "Nope." Tommy spit into the dirt. But the house still stands. Sometimes that's enough. The next morning, a cold wind blew down from the ridge. Jack hammered harder. He started early, determined to finish laying the last of the new sheeting before nightfall. Each hit of the hammer echoed into the valley below like a pulse, a heartbeat. The cabin creaked under him, but held. Boone barked from the ground every time Jack cursed or dropped a nail, as if cheering him on or heckling him. It was hard to tell. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Jack hammered the final nail into the last metal sheet. He sat back on his heels, sweat-soaked and filthy, but grinning. The roof was done. Patchwork ugly and far from perfect, but dry, solid, his. He sat there for a long moment, watching the sky turn orange. Boone barked once, wagging his tail. Jack whispered, "That's one thing. One real thing." Inside the cabin, the air already felt different. Not just warmer, but steadier, like the place was finally recognizing him as more than a visitor. He lit a lantern and stared at the rafters. The new wood stood out against the dark grain of the old walls like a scar. Honest. Earned. That night, he and Boone slept inside the cabin for the first time. No creaks, no leaks, no cold draft whispering through the gaps. Jack lay on a bedroll on the floor, staring up at the patchy ceiling. Boone curled beside him. The dog snored. Outside, owls called through the dark. Jack didn't dream of lawyers or courtrooms or Melissa's silence. He dreamed of trees and wind and the weight of a hammer in his hand. The next morning, as he was hauling the trash wood out to burn, a flash of blue caught his eye between the trees. A woman was hiking up the trail alone. A backpack slung over her shoulders, boots caked with mud. She stopped when she saw the cabin. When she saw him. Jack froze. Boone didn't bark. He just stared. The woman raised a hand. "Hey," she said. "Sorry. Didn't know anyone lived up here." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded slowly. "You're not lost." She shook her head. "Not exactly." She looked over his shoulder at the cabin, eyebrows raised. "You fixed that thing?" Jack half smiled. "Starting to." The woman stepped closer, curious, not cautious. Her face was tired but open, the way people look after a long drive with nowhere left to go. "Name's Lena," she said, offering her hand. Jack shook it. "Jack." She looked around again. "This place is something." Jack glanced back at the cabin. "It's mine," he said. "For now." Jack didn't expect Lena to stay more than 10 minutes. She looked like she'd just wandered off one of those trail blogs, clean boots, newer pack jacket, the color of maple bark. Probably just another weekend hiker, he figured, passing through, snapping pictures, chasing silence because it was fashionable. But an hour later, she was still there, sipping coffee from an old chipped mug on his porch, asking questions like she wasn't in any hurry to go anywhere. Boone sat between them, head on his paws, occasionally flicking his eyes between the two like a referee watching for trouble. He wasn't sure what to make of her yet. Neither was Jack. "You live here full-time?" she asked. "Trying to." She studied the cabin. "You fix it up yourself, roof?" "Walls, stoves next." He pointed with his thumb toward the rusted cast-iron lump inside. "Impressive," she said. Jack shrugged. "Desperate more than impressive." Lena smiled faintly. "Desperate gets more done than comfortable." By mid-afternoon, clouds started gathering over the ridge. Lena glanced at the sky. "Mind if I hang around until the storm passes? My tent's another 2 miles out, and I don't really want to hike in thunder." Jack didn't answer right away. But Boone didn't growl. That was good enough. They spent the evening cooking canned beans over a makeshift propane burner. Lena shared half a granola bar with Boone, who accepted it like it was filet mignon. Jack watched her move, how she checked the wind, how she packed her empty mug away without needing to be told. Not just a tourist, then. She'd done this before. "Where you headed?" Jack asked. She shrugged. "Nowhere. Everywhere. I quit my job 6 weeks ago. Sold my place. Been hiking the Blue Ridge hoping to clear my head." "What did you quit?" "Teaching," she said. "5th grade. Burned out. Parents yelling. Kids zoned out. No room to breathe." Jack nodded. "I get that." Lena tilted her head. "What about you?" "What brought you up here?" Jack thought for a long second. Then, losing everything. "Divorce," he gave a slight nod. "Career," another nod. "Faith in humanity." Jack chuckled. "That too." She leaned back, looking at the tree line where shadows stretched like long fingers. "Well, looks like you found something else." Jack didn't answer, but he was starting to think she might be right. Later that night, a sharp clap of thunder jolted Boone awake. Rain lashed against the cabin roof, steady, loud, comforting in its own wild way. Lena was curled up in her sleeping bag near the stove, reading a dog-eared book by lantern light. Jack sat against the far wall, sketching cabin upgrades on the back of a feed bag. "Can I ask you something?" she said, not looking up. "Sure. Do you ever wonder if this is just running away?" Jack didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "Every day." She closed the book. "But you're still here," she said. He nodded. "That's gotta mean something," she whispered. The storm passed overnight, and by morning Lena was packing up. "You sure you're good out there alone?" Jack asked. Lena grinned. "You're the one with a roof made of leftover metal sheets and a dog guarding an old stove." Boone barked as if confirming her point. She hoisted her pack. "I'll circle back in a few days if I'm still alive." Jack smirked. "Thanks for the warning." She turned once before heading into the trees. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're doing more than surviving here." Jack watched her go, the trees swallowing her footsteps like they'd never been there. That afternoon, Jack went down to the creek to fill his water containers. The path was muddy, slick from the rain. Boone ran ahead, tongue-lolling tail a blur. He'd adapted to mountain life faster than Jack had, like he'd been waiting for this all along. The creek still ran fast and cold. Jack crouched near a rock shelf to submerge his canteens when Boone's bark tore through the quiet. Then a growl. Low. Deep. Not playful. Jack turned. Boone stood frozen 10 feet away, eyes locked on the trees behind them, fur bristling like static. Then Jack saw it. 2 yellow eyes in the brush. A hulking shadow. A bear. Big. Black. Closer than was comfortable. Jack didn't move. Boone didn't charge, just growled, stepping slowly back toward Jack. The bear huffed, swaying its head, sniffing. It hadn't committed. Not yet. Jack slowly stood, raised his arms, and shouted deep and loud and full of every drop of fear he'd swallowed since arriving here. "Hey!" The bear hesitated, then snorted, and vanished into the trees. Jack didn't breathe for several seconds. Boone stood beside him, tail low, ears back. Jack finally exhaled, whispering, "The mountain doesn't care if you're tired, hungry, or heartbroken." He reached down and rubbed Boone's ears. "But you do, good boy." They hiked back faster, keeping to the main trail. Jack's nerves stayed high the rest of the day. That night he moved all his dry food from the old wood bin to inside the cabin, hanging it in sealed containers from the rafters. He made a list for better bear-proof storage reel bins, maybe metal, like the kind he saw in national parks. He realized bitterly that he was dangerously underprepared. Just because you want to live in the wild doesn't mean it wants you here. The next few days were quiet. Jack worked on sealing the last wall gaps with moss and tar. He fashioned a primitive washing station with a salvaged bucket and rain catch. He began logging daily routines in a spiral notebook, a habit Lena had encouraged. In the evenings, he wrote without filter. He wrote about Melissa, how he missed her in flashes, not constantly, but with a kind of phantom pain. How he wasn't sure if he missed her, or just the version of himself he thought he was when they were together. He wrote about the silence, how it carved him open, but also closed some wounds. He wrote about Boone, how this dog had been the only thing that hadn't left him, how Boone never needed an explanation, just presence. By the end of the week, Jack had built a new firewood rack, patched a broken window frame, and started sketching a rough plan for a small workbench by the cabin's south wall. Purpose made the days pass faster. The body grew sore but steady. Still, he found himself glancing toward the trail some evenings, wondering if Lena would come back, wondering if anyone ever did. It wasn't until the third day after the bear encounter that Jack hiked higher up the ridge, chasing sunlight and trying to find dry kindling. Half a mile in, he found it. A flat outcropping of stone with a view of the valley below, trees stretching like ocean waves into forever. Carved into the largest boulder, half buried under moss, were initials T. Graves. 1967. Still breathing. Jack stared at it, wind threading through his jacket. He didn't touch the stone, but something about it made him feel less alone. Somebody else had been here, survived here, chosen this too. That night, under a blanket of stars, Jack lay beside Boone on the cabin floor, scratching words into his notebook by lantern glow. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel lost. Just here, alive. The first time Jack saw the stranger, he thought it was a trick of the trees. A flicker, just a blur of movement beyond the pines near the creek bed. Boone stopped mid-stride, hackles lifting, tail stiff. Jack narrowed his eyes, hand instinctively going to the hatchet looped through his belt. But when he pushed through the brush, the only thing waiting on the other side was the sound of wind and running water. Still, the feeling lingered like a note left ringing after the music ends. That night, Boone stayed closer than usual. He didn't sleep at the foot of the bedroll, but right beside Jack, back pressed against his side like a sentry, refusing to clock out. Jack lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling beams, counting the knots in the wood. Something was shifting. The mountain felt different. The next morning, while boiling creek water over a fire, he spotted it, bare footprints in the mud, heading east. Human, bare, and fresh. Jack stood, frozen steam rising from the pot beside him. He crouched and examined them. Wide toes, deep heel, no shoe tread. Whoever it was, they'd come down the same trail Jack used to gather water, and left just before dawn. Boone whined softly, sniffing the tracks, ears tilted back. Jack looked into the woods, jaw clenched. You don't sneak through someone's camp barefoot unless you want to be seen. He grabbed his pack, tucked a flashlight and a flare knife inside, and followed. The tracks were surprisingly easy to follow, pressed into damp moss and soft pine needles. Jack moved cautiously, not trying to be silent, but not storming either. Boone stayed glued to his side, eyes always ahead, muscles tight. A quarter mile in, Jack paused. Smoke, thin, faint, but definitely there. He followed the scent downhill until it opened onto a small grove partially hidden behind a fallen log and thick brush. There, nestled beside a massive boulder, was a makeshift camp. Blankets, tin cans, a fire ring still warm, and next to the fire, sitting with a calm that struck Jack like a slap, was a man. Long beard, matted hair, skin weathered and tanned like old leather. His clothes were shredded denim and wool layered like armor, and his eyes, sharp pale gray, watched Jack with no surprise at all. "Thought it was just you and the dog," the man said, voice raspy but steady. Jack didn't answer right away. Boone growled low. The stranger nodded toward the dog. "He's got good ears." Jack shifted his weight. "You've been around my cabin." The man shrugged. "Only when you were asleep. That's supposed to make it better." "Nope." A pause. Then the man said, "Name's Eli." Jack stayed quiet. Eli added, "Been up here a long time." Jack finally said, "How long?" Eli smirked. "Long enough to forget what month it is." They talked in fragments. Jack never sat, never dropped his guard. Boone never took his eyes off Eli. The man didn't offer food or water, just answers piece by piece. He'd come to the mountains 15 years ago after his wife died in a car crash that also took their daughter. Left the world behind. No funeral, no return address. Built a shelter, lived on what he could trap and forage kept away from towns. Most folks thought he was dead. Some days Eli said he wasn't sure they were wrong. "Why now?" Jack finally asked. "Why show yourself?" Eli looked up at the treetops. "Because you made noise." Jack frowned. "People who come up here either stay quiet and die, or they make noise 'cause they're still fighting. You think I'm fighting?" Eli's gaze locked on his. "I think you don't know what you're doing yet. And the mountain doesn't forgive confusion." Jack didn't return to the cabin until late afternoon. The woods felt heavier now, like they were watching him more than sheltering him. He kept looking over his shoulder. Eli didn't follow, but Jack knew he wasn't far. Back at the cabin, Jack fortified the door, added a makeshift latch, and tied Boone's leash to his wrist before bed. Not because he thought Eli meant harm, but because something about the encounter had peeled back a layer of safety Jack didn't know he'd wrapped around himself. That night, sleep came in restless pieces. And just before dawn, Jack awoke to find a rabbit carcass hanging from a nail on the cabin door. Freshly skinned, clean, no blood, no note, just left, a gift, or a warning. He cooked it that morning. Boone devoured his share. Jack chewed slowly, unsure if the meat sat heavier in his stomach or in his chest. Eli hadn't vanished. He'd claimed space. Over the next few days, Jack found more signs. A line of stones across the creek not there before. A carved stick left on his woodpile. The distinct whistle of an unfamiliar tune echoing faintly through the pines just before sunset. None of it hostile, but none of it friendly either. It was presence, undeniable and unspoken. Jack began to realize something. Eli wasn't just a hermit. He was the mountain's ghost, the version of Jack who never stopped running. Then Lena returned. She appeared just before dark, backpack slung low, face flushed from the hike. Boone barked once and sprinted to greet her. Jack stood at the cabin door, relief flooding his chest faster than he could admit. "You look like you've seen something," she said, dropping her pack. Jack just nodded. "You ever heard of someone named Eli?" Lena froze. Then slowly, "Locals talk about him. Call him the Phantom of Ridge Hollow. Most think he's made up. He's not." Her eyes sharpened. He came to you, Jack nodded. She looked toward the woods. That's not nothing, she said. No, Jack agreed. It's definitely something. That night, Lena and Jack sat outside, fire crackling low. Boone snored beside them. Jack told her everything, Eli's camp, his eyes, the rabbit, the messages he didn't say with words. Lena listened silent for a long time after. Finally, she said, maybe he's what the mountain turns you into, if you stay too long and stop talking. Jack stared into the fire. Then I need to keep building, he said. Lena glanced over. Why? Jack leaned forward, voice low but certain. Because if you don't build something out here, the wilderness builds you into someone else. The next morning, Jack took an axe and started clearing space behind the cabin. For a garden, for a bench, for something that said human. He didn't know if Eli was watching. But Jack was done running. The fog rolled in before dawn, thick and low like the earth itself was exhaling something it didn't want to carry anymore. Jack stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee and saw nothing beyond 10 feet. Trees disappeared into white. The cabin looked like it was floating. Even Boone stayed close, uneasy, his paws quiet on the wood. Lena joined him moments later, jacket zipped to her chin, arms folded tight. She'd camped beside the cabin again last night, said it was only for one more evening, but Jack noticed she'd stopped setting a hard departure date. Feels different this morning, she said, scanning the fog. Yeah, Jack muttered. Feels like something's watching. Boone whined softly. It wasn't just the weather. Something was coming. They spent the morning chopping firewood. Jack focused on the rhythm, the swing, the crack, the split. Boone lay nearby, chewing a stick with mild interest. Lena moved between tending the fire pit and digging into her trail notes, scribbling thoughts Jack never asked about, but kind of wanted to. By noon, the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened. The world felt muffled, like sound had weight. That's when the first scream echoed from the ridge. Jack froze mid-swing. The axe stuck half-buried in a log. Lena stood up straight, eyes wide. Boone bolted upright, ears pinned. The scream came again, closer now. Human, sharp, not an animal. Jack yanked the axe free and turned toward the sound. Lena was already pulling on her pack. You can't go into that blind, she warned. Someone's out there, Jack said. She grabbed her flashlight and a small first aid kit. Then we both go. They moved fast but carefully, staying just ahead of Boone as he tracked the sound. The trees blurred around them, shapes melting into fog roots reaching up like fingers. Jack's boots slipped twice on moss-slick rocks, but adrenaline kept him upright. The scream came again, shorter this time, ragged. It led them down a slope Jack hadn't explored before, steep and thorn-choked. The fog made depth impossible to judge. And then through the gray, they saw him, a boy, no more than 12, lying at the bottom of the incline, twisted at an awkward angle beside a shattered mountain bike. One leg was bent the wrong way. Mud covered his jacket. His face was pale lips, cracked eyes wild. Jack dropped to his knees beside him. It's okay, he said, trying to sound steady. We're gonna help you. The boy blinked, panicked. My brother, he went ahead. I crashed. He didn't come back. Lena knelt opposite Jack. How long ago? An hour, the boy wheezed. Maybe more. I yelled and yelled. No one came. Let's stabilize his leg, Lena said, already pulling gauze and sticks from her pack. Jack nodded and took off his jacket, rolling it to cushion the boy's head. Hey, he said softly. What's your name, Caleb? I'm Jack. This is Lena. That's Boone. He gestured toward the dog, now scanning the fog like he expected ghosts to emerge. We've got you now, Caleb. The boy's lip trembled. I thought I was going to die out here. Jack looked him in the eye. Not today, he said. Not while I'm breathing. It took an hour to splint Caleb's leg and rig a stretcher from branches and an old tarp Lena had in her pack. They moved slowly, carefully, with Jack at the front, Lena at the back, and Boone scouting ahead. Fog swallowed the forest. The trail disappeared behind them every few steps. It was like moving through memory, uncertain, soft around the edges, heavy with meaning. Halfway back to the cabin, Boone stopped suddenly, growled. Jack froze. What is it, boy? A voice came from the fog. Low, shaky. Caleb, everyone turned. A taller boy stumbled toward them, 14, maybe 15. Mud on his jeans, blood on his temple face, twisted in panic. Caleb Evan, the injured boy, cried. The older one ran forward, dropping to his knees. I looked for you. I didn't know which way you fell. I thought. Jack placed a hand on the kid's shoulder. He's gonna be okay. Let's get both of you out of here. Evan helped carry the stretcher the rest of the way, not saying much. His hand stayed on Caleb's shoulder, even as he walked. By the time they reached the clearing, the fog had started to thin. Back at the cabin, Jack and Lena wrapped Caleb in blankets and started a fire inside. Lena made broth from dried beans and salted jerky. The boys devoured it like they hadn't eaten in days. Evan explained between bites they'd snuck out of their campsite with a cheap map and a bike Evan had found near an old trail. Got lost. Then separated. No cell service. No compass. No idea how far off course they'd gone. You saved his life, Evan said quietly. Jack shook his head. You yelled. We just answered. Tommy showed up an hour later in his rusted pickup after Jack hiked to a high ridge and got one weak bar of signal to send a text. The boys were loaded into the truck with care, Caleb's leg braced and pain manageable. Tommy looked at Jack before climbing into the driver's seat. You're not just surviving up here, he said. You're part of this place now. Jack said nothing, but something inside him cracked open softly, quietly, and light bled through. After the truck disappeared down the trail, Lena and Jack sat by the fire in silence. Boone curled at their feet, eyes closed, finally relaxed. Lena stared into the flames. You okay? Jack nodded slowly. Then, it felt good. Doing something that mattered. She looked over. You matter. He exhaled long and slow. Funny, he said. I came here to vanish, and the mountain keeps pulling me back into the world. That night, sleep came hard and deep. When Jack woke, Boone was already at the door, tail wagging. Outside, the fog was gone. In its place, morning sun, golden and wide, clear, a new day. The letter had been sitting in Jack's backpack for months. Folded into quarters, creased and weathered, tucked beneath a water filter and a battered paperback he never read. He found it that morning while digging for a spare lighter. It stopped him cold. The envelope was unsealed. No stamp. Just a name written in his own hand, Melissa. He sat down on the edge of the porch, Boone beside him, watching the trees sway in a gentle breeze. Autumn was crawling down the ridge, one leaf at a time. The tips of the maples were starting to flush red. Jack held the letter between his fingers like it might burn him. He'd written it the night after she left. The night everything fell apart. But he'd never mailed it. Couldn't. Wouldn't. Didn't know which, now though something in him needed to read it. Needed to remember what was raw before it turned numb. He unfolded the page. Melissa. I wish I could say I'm writing this to explain everything. But the truth is, I don't understand it either. How we got here. How I lost you. How I lost myself. I was trying. Maybe not in ways that looked good from the outside, but I swear to God I was fighting. For us. For the life we planned. I got tired of pretending I was okay when I wasn't. You left me with silence. And I deserved that. But I hope someday you know the silence didn't mean I stopped loving you. It meant I didn't know how to stop hurting. I came here because there was nowhere else to go. Because I needed to remember what it meant to be useful. To build something real. To fix what I could, even if it's just broken wood and rusted nails. I don't know if I'll ever send this. Maybe I'm just writing it to prove I'm still here. Still breathing. Still trying. Jack, he folded the letter slowly, the paper now softer, almost delicate. Like the memory of pain after the wound had scabbed over. Boone rested his head on Jack's knee tail, thumping once. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You think I should send it?" he asked. Boone sneezed. Jack chuckled. "Yeah, me neither." Later that day, Lena helped him dig a trench for a drainage system behind the cabin. The early rains had flooded the west wall twice already. The soil was stubborn roots like cables, rocks like fists, but the work felt good. "What's got you so quiet?" she asked, wiping dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand. Jack hesitated. "Found something this morning. An old letter from before, yeah." "You read it?" He nodded. "You gonna send it?" Jack leaned on the shovel. "I don't think it's for her anymore." Lena glanced over, brow lifted. "Then who's it for?" He shrugged. "Maybe just me. A version of me that needed to hear those words." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes the letter you never send is the one that finally lets you move on." That evening, Lena found an old tin box buried beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin. They'd been trying to level the boards when her boot struck something hollow-sounding. Inside the box were 2 items, a rusted key and a stack of weathered index cards bound with twine. On each card was a single sentence handwritten in neat block letters. They sat at the table reading through them one by one. "Start small, finish big. Don't fight the mountain, learn from it. Silence can heal, but too much of it turns into a cage." Jack turned the cards in his hand like a deck of memory. "These aren't survival tips," Lena murmured. "They're lessons. Whoever lived here before us, they left breadcrumbs." Boone sniffed the key, uninterested. Jack studied it. "Maybe it opens the old shed down the hill. I thought that was empty. Maybe it's not." The next morning, Jack and Lena hiked to the shed. The wood was warped, door half-rotted, padlock rusted but intact. The key turned with a loud metallic snap. Inside was dust, cobwebs, and a trunk. Jack knelt and opened it slowly. Inside were more cards, a journal, a folded tarp, a child's drawing. A man's name was written on the inside cover of the journal, Thomas Graves. Jack stared at it, something clicking into place. "Eli," he whispered. Lena leaned in. "Wait." "That's," Jack nodded. "That's his real name." The journal was filled with entries, some rambling, some precise. Most were about solitude, about grief, about the silence of trees and the weight of memory. But one line stood out. It was circled 3 times in red ink, jagged and angry. "What's the point of surviving if you forget how to be human?" Jack closed the book, his pulse steady but hard. He suddenly understood why Eli had watched him so closely, why he'd left the rabbit, why he hadn't vanished. Eli wasn't just hiding, he was warning. That night, Jack added a new line to his own notebook: "You can build walls to keep the world out. but eventually those same walls keep you from ever going back. He looked over at Lena, who was tending the fire with Boone at her side. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we build the greenhouse." Lena blinked, surprised. "Thought you were saving that for spring." "I'm not waiting anymore." As they sat in silence, flames flickering across the walls, Lena pulled something from her jacket pocket and slid it across the table. It was a blank envelope. Jack frowned. "What's this?" She didn't look at him. "In case you decide to send the letter, or write a new one. Either way, the act of sealing it matters." Jack stared at it. So simple. So small. But it felt like a line in the sand. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go," he admitted. Lena looked up. "You don't have to let go of the past," she said. "You just have to stop letting it anchor you." Later that night, while the wind whispered through the trees and the fire died to embers, Jack sat at the table with a pen. He didn't open the old letter again. He just wrote a new one. This time to himself. The first shovel hit dirt just after sunrise. Mist clung to the earth like memory. The ground was wet but not frozen yet, just soft enough to dig. Jack had marked the greenhouse layout with old rope and sticks the night before, and now standing at the edge of the rectangle, he took a long breath. "This isn't just about plants," he said aloud. Lena, tying her hair back, smirked. "No kidding." Jack sank the shovel again, and again. Boone sat nearby, tail wagging every time the dirt flew. They worked in silence for hours, clearing rocks, loosening the stubborn clay. Lena moved like she'd been born to do this, efficient, tough, no complaints. Jack had never known anyone who could make physical labor feel like therapy. She didn't just build with her hands. She steadied things. "Do you even like gardening?" she asked him during a break. "I like the idea of it," Jack said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Takes time. Patience. Nothing you can fake." Lena nodded. "It's a promise. You plant something, you're telling the world you plan to be around when it grows." Jack looked out over the ridge. The trees, the cabin, the bones of the greenhouse to be. "Then let's make a promise the mountain can't erase." By noon, the foundation trench was done. Jack mixed gravel and sand by hand, poured it in layers. Lena measured support post positions, checking twice before they dug again. Everything felt sharper now, focused. They weren't just surviving the wilderness anymore. They were committing to it. Midway through the second frame beam, Jack caught a movement in the corner of his eye, just at the tree line. Boone saw it too. Barked once. No hackles, just alert. It was Eli. He stood half-shrouded in trees, arms crossed, face unreadable. Jack raised a hand. Eli didn't wave back. He watched them work for a long minute before turning and vanishing into the woods again like smoke. Lena came up beside him. "He always does that." "Lately, yeah. You think he approves?" Jack thought about it. "No. I think he's afraid." By late afternoon, the first wall was up-angled perfectly to catch morning sun. They stepped back to admire it, sweat streaked and aching. Lena wiped her hands on her jeans. "That's not bad for two people with no blueprint and one dog supervisor." Boone barked in agreement. Jack stared at the wooden frame, heart thudding with something like pride. "We could grow lettuce," he said. Lena laughed. "Dream big, Jack. Tomatoes, maybe. Beans." She glanced sideways. "Flowers," Jack hesitated. "I was thinking maybe sunflowers. For the edge." She smiled softly. Sunflowers don't quit easy. No, Jack agreed. They always turn toward the light. That night they lit a small fire in front of the half-finished greenhouse and ate by lamplight. Jack grilled canned beans and mushrooms on flat rocks near the coals. Lena passed around pieces of dried apple she'd packed from a market in town. Do you ever think, she asked between bites, that we were meant to end up here? Jack considered it. I think the world breaks everyone eventually. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you land somewhere soft. This place isn't soft, she said. No, but it's honest. After dinner, Lena unrolled a canvas bundle filled with seeds. These were supposed to be for my mom's garden, she said quietly. Back home. But after she passed, I couldn't bring myself to plant them. Jack looked at the seed packets: carrots, squash chives, marigolds. He reached over and gently tapped the bag. Maybe they were waiting for the right ground. Lena didn't say anything, but she didn't put the seeds away. Later, as they sat under the stars, Jack found himself reaching for his notebook. He scribbled, "A greenhouse is a contradiction, fragile walls holding back the wild just enough to let life begin again." He tapped the pen against the page, then added, "Maybe that's what I've been trying to build inside myself." Just before midnight, Lena walked toward the cabin. She paused at the door and looked back. "You really gonna finish it?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah." And after that, he didn't have an answer, but he knew he'd figure it out here, not anywhere else. The next morning, they returned to the site and started on the roof beams. The fog had lifted. The mountain air felt thinner, crisper. They were halfway through measuring the second rafter when Jack heard a familiar engine. He turned. Tommy's truck crawled up the trail tires, grinding on dirt and gravel. He parked. Crooked climbed out slow. "Thought I'd find you two neck-deep in trouble," he said. "Didn't expect a damn greenhouse." Lena waved. "We do all kinds of dumb projects." Tommy stepped up, chewing a toothpick. "You're serious about this, huh?" Jack nodded. "Yeah." Tommy scratched his chin. "You know winter's coming. You're gonna need insulation. Maybe poly panels. I'll figure it out." Tommy nodded slowly, then said, "I might have some old stuff in the barn, if you ain't too proud to take it." Jack smiled. "I'm past pride." Tommy smirked. "Good. Pride'll starve you faster than winter." When Tommy left, Jack stood alone in the half-formed shell of the greenhouse. He looked at the beams, the bare earth, the sky above. He whispered, "We're building something the storm won't take." And he believed it. That night a wind swept down from the ridge. Cold, sharp, the first whisper of real change. But the cabin stayed warm. And outside, tucked beside the cabin wall in a covered box, waited a small paper envelope. Inside it, a sunflower seed and a note. "The light's in you now. E." The wind changed 3 days after the greenhouse was finished. It wasn't just colder. It was different, restless, unpredictable. Like the mountain had started remembering something it didn't want to say out loud. Jack stood at the edge of the ridge near sunset, his coat zipped up, collar raised. Boone was stiff beside him, ears twitching with every gust. The sky burned orange and rust bleeding behind the treetops like some slow, quiet warning. Lena emerged from the greenhouse, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Something's coming," she said. Jack didn't look at her, just nodded. "Storm. Feels bigger than weather." That night the wind didn't howl. It whispered. It scraped its nails along the roof. It tapped the window panes like fingers asking to be let in. Boone growled once and slept near the door. Jack couldn't sleep. Around midnight, he lit the stove and pulled out Thomas Graves's journal again. Eli's words, his past. He flipped to the marked page, the one he kept coming back to. The forest never forgets. It holds your footsteps, your mistakes, your silence. And when the wind shifts, it carries your ghosts back to you. Jack whispered to himself. What if some ghosts never left? He didn't know if he was talking about Eli, or Melissa, or some part of himself still buried up here waiting to be found. The next morning, Lena didn't come out of her tent. Jack waited until almost 9, then knocked on the canvas flap. No answer. Boone stood at his side, tense. He unzipped it slowly. She was curled on her side, shivering. Not from cold, he saw that instantly, but from something deeper. Her skin was clammy, her breath shallow. Food poisoning fever. Jack didn't wait. He wrapped her in blankets, carried her inside the cabin, and stoked the fire higher. Boone circled nervously, whimpering. Lena blinked up at him, dazed. It's inside me. What is the wind? She whispered. It brought something. He sat beside her most of the day, spooning water into her mouth when she could drink. Her fever rose, broke, then returned in waves. Jack read through the emergency manual Lena had packed months ago. She'd scribbled notes in the margins, pages about mountain-borne illnesses, spores, old viruses thawing from frozen ground. Nothing fit. But one entry stood out, hypothermia of the mind, not just physical. Isolation, trauma, grief can crash the system like frost on weak glass. He looked at Lena's face, her eyes glassy, her hands clenching and unclenching, like she was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. This wasn't sickness. It was collapse. Night fell heavy again. Jack sat at the table, eyes burning the weight of helplessness, pressing down like fresh snow. Boone barked suddenly. Once. Jack turned. A figure was outside. Still. Watching. Eli. Jack grabbed his coat and stepped outside, boots crunching frost-laced dirt. Eli didn't move. You knew this would happen, Jack said. Eli said nothing. She trusted this place. I trusted it. Eli nodded slowly. And the mountain doesn't care who you are. It only offers mirrors. Jack clenched his fists. Then what do I do? Eli stared into the trees. You listen to the wind, not to fear it, but to understand what it's trying to return to you. Jack swallowed. She's not strong like you. She doesn't want to vanish. Eli turned his eyes to Jack, gray and piercing. Neither did I. But I let it happen. The two men stood in silence, the cold seeping into their bones. Finally, Eli stepped closer. From his coat, he pulled a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Boil this. Inhale it. Put it near her skin. Jack took it. Herbs. Roots. Bark. What is it? Memory, Eli said. The kind that fights forgetting. Back inside, Jack set the kettle, unwrapped the bundle, and added the contents. The cabin filled with a bitter, pine-heavy scent, almost metallic. He laid the cloth near Lena's chest, watched her breathing slow. Then stop hitching. Then deepen. She slept. And for the first time in 12 hours, so did Jack. When morning came, the wind was gone. Lena opened her eyes, voice hoarse. You stayed. Jack nodded. She touched his hand, weak but present. I dreamt I was buried in snow. But something kept digging. I think it was Boone. Jack smiled faintly. He's persistent. So are you. She sat up later that day, ate broth, sipped water. Color returned to her cheeks slowly, as if reluctant. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. By dusk, she stood by herself and walked to the greenhouse. She pressed her fingers to the glass. "This is the first thing I've built that might still be here when I'm gone," she said. Jack joined her. "I think that's what Eli's afraid of. That he left nothing behind but silence." Lena looked at him. "We won't," she said. That night, Jack opened his notebook and wrote, "When the wind remembers, it doesn't return to haunt you. It returns to ask, what will you leave behind?" He stared at the words for a long time. Then slowly he turned the page and began sketching plans for a second cabin. Smaller, simpler, but enough. The fire started just after midnight. Jack woke to Boone growling low, deep in his throat. At first he thought it was another dream, one of those half-formed mountain visions too tangled in memory to be real. But the glow outside the window wasn't moonlight. It was orange, moving. He threw off the blankets and rushed to the door. The greenhouse was burning. Flames licked up the frame like hungry fingers, wood popping and groaning as plastic sheeting melted into dripping, hissing ribbons. The air reeked of scorched soil and chemical smoke. Sparks spiraled into the trees. Jack ran for the water barrel. Lena was already outside, dragging the hose, barefoot and breathless. "What happened?" she shouted. "I don't know." They sprayed what they could, dousing the nearby brush first to keep the fire from spreading. Boone darted along the perimeter, barking into the trees like the threat was still out there. Maybe it was. By dawn, the fire was out. What remained of the greenhouse was blackened skeletons of wood and melted puddles of plastic and glass. The earth inside was scorched seedlings, nothing but ash. Lena stood beside the ruined arms, crossed over her chest, face unreadable. Jack didn't say anything at first. Then, "We can rebuild it." She didn't look at him. "Yeah, but it won't be the same." "I know." A long silence. Then Lena turned to him, jaw clenched. "Someone did this." Jack nodded. It wasn't the wind. They searched the area. Jack found a trail, broken branches, heavy footprints moving away from the cabin and into the woods. Too big to be Eli's. Too careless. He crouched, fingers hovering above a scuffed patch of dirt. "They weren't hiding," he said. "They wanted us to see it." Lena looked at the charred remains behind them. A warning. Or a message. Boone whined. His tail dropped. They followed the trail until the trees thickened and the signs vanished into hard-packed soil. No smoke, no footprints, just cold silence. When they returned to the cabin, Eli was waiting. Standing by the porch, arms crossed, eyes storm-dark. "You saw it?" Jack asked. "I smelled it," Eli said. "Half the ridge probably did." Lena stepped forward. "You know who did it?" Eli hesitated. Jack saw it. The flicker. The way he didn't answer right away. "What aren't you telling us?" Eli sighed. "There's someone else. Lives 2 valleys over. Used to run with survivalists back in the day. Left that life behind, or claimed to. But he's always hated outsiders." Jack narrowed his eyes. "He's been watching us." "Probably. And he doesn't like people turning wild land into something else." Lena's voice was sharp. "What's his name? Griffin?" "Call him Griff. Doesn't like strangers. Especially not ones who build things." Jack clenched his fists. Why now? Eli looked toward the smoke-stained horizon. Because you made this place visible. First the kids you saved. Then Tommy bringing supplies. You brought the world here. That night Jack couldn't sit still. The rage in him was new. Hot. Controlled, but only just. The greenhouse had been more than a building. It was a statement. A commitment. And someone had tried to erase it. He sat at the table with Lena and Eli laying out a hand-drawn map of the mountain. We need to know where he is, Jack said, and we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Lena looked him in the eye. You're not talking about revenge, right? Jack shook his head. No, I'm talking about boundaries. Eli traced a finger along the ridge. He's likely here. Old mining cabin. Used to be a commune base back in the 90s. Jack stared at the spot. We hike at first light. They left Boone with Tommy. If things turned bad, Jack didn't want him caught in the middle. It was the first time Boone had been apart from him in months. As they hiked, Lena broke the silence. You're not the man who came up here to hide, she said. Jack looked over. She added, you're the man who stayed to fight for what matters. Jack said nothing, but the words lit something in him that the fire couldn't burn down. The path to Griff's cabin was steep and narrow. Ice clung to the shadows. They moved slow, cautious, until the tree line thinned and the cabin came into view. Weathered wood-rusted roof smoke rising from a crooked chimney. Jack stepped forward. Eli stopped him with a hand. Let me go first. He walked ahead alone, hands up, voice calm. Jack and Lena waited behind a low rock wall, hearts pounding. They heard shouting, a slam, then silence. Eli reappeared, eyes hard. He's not going to come back near you. Not unless you give him reason. Jack frowned. That's it, he got the message. Lena crossed her arms. And what was the message? Ew. Eli's mouth twitched. That not everyone out here is as forgiving as you two. On the way back, Lena touched Jack's arm. You trust him? Jack looked toward Eli. I trust that he knows what this place does to people when they're left alone too long. Back at the cabin, the smoke had cleared. The ashes had cooled. Boone barked and leapt into Jack's arms like he'd been gone a month. Jack knelt in the wreckage of the greenhouse that evening, touched the soil, still warm, still alive. He turned to Lena. We build it again. She smiled, but he wasn't done. And we build more. She tilted her head. More. Jack stood. A second cabin. A proper rain catch system. A signal relay. And when the next storm comes, he looked at the mountains beyond. It won't find us waiting. It'll find us ready. That night he wrote in his notebook, ashes don't mean the end. They're just proof that something lived, and if it lived once, it can live again. The fire hadn't taken everything, just the easy part. Now it was time for iron. The silence came back 2 weeks later, but not in the way Jack expected. This wasn't the soft, reflective kind, the kind that wrapped around you at night and let you breathe. This was the sharp, heavy kind, the kind that pressed against your chest like weight you couldn't shake. It started with Eli's absence. For days, Jack had noticed the lack of his usual signs, no stacked stones on the trail, no traps reset, no distant whistles. Boone sniffed around the edge of the old pine where Eli used to watch from, but there was no scent, no trace, like he'd vanished again. Jack didn't say anything at first. He figured Eli needed space. That was how the man operated. But by day 4, Jack knew something was wrong. He woke before dawn, slipped on his pack, and started up the ridge. Lena stood in the doorway behind him, arms crossed against the cold. "You think he's hurt? I don't know," Jack said. "But I think he's gone quiet for the wrong reasons." Lena tossed him a thermos. "Then don't come back without him." The climb was brutal. Snow had come early, thin but biting. The path to the west ridge was steep, and the cold had made the ground brittle. Jack kept moving one step at a time, boots crunching through frost. Boone stayed close, ears alert, tracking with intensity. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the clearing where Eli's cabin had once stood, long since collapsed, swallowed by moss and rot. That's where Jack saw it. Boot prints. Fresh. And then something else. A snare trap disarmed and left hanging with a twig shoved through the loop. A message. Still here. Boone barked once and bounded ahead. Jack followed, pushing through branches, ducking under pine boughs until he reached the edge of the overlook. Eli was there, sitting on a stump, rifle across his lap, eyes on the valley. He didn't turn when Jack approached. Jack dropped into a crouch beside him. "I thought you disappeared." Eli didn't look away. "I almost did." Jack studied his face. Pale. Thinner. Eyes darker than usual. "You sick? No. Just hollow." Silence. Then Eli said, "I went down to Griff's place a few nights ago, just to make sure he kept his word." Jack's pulse ticked higher, and Eli's fingers gripped the rifle tighter. He was gone. Cabin empty. But there were signs. He's not done. Jack's stomach twisted. "You think he's circling back? I think he's watching, waiting for the next thing to break." They sat in silence, the cold creeping into Jack's knees. Then Eli added, "You ever wonder if the mountain tests you, not with storms or wild animals, but with silence, with the things you choose to do when no one's looking?" Jack didn't answer right away. "Then the mountain doesn't care who you are, but it remembers who you try to be." Eli finally looked at him, and for a moment, Jack saw it, the man beneath the scars, beneath the decades of isolation. Human, haunted, trying. They hiked back down together. Slowly. No words. At the cabin, Lena had soup waiting. She didn't ask questions, just set 3 bowls out and poured tea like it was the most natural thing in the world. Eli ate in silence, then helped Jack chop wood without being asked. They didn't talk about Griff that night, or the greenhouse ruins, or the new structure Jack had begun to frame beside the cabin. But they all knew. Things were changing again. Later, Jack stood outside with Boone watching the stars blink to life above the tree line. Lena joined him quietly. "You found him," she said. "Yeah. He okay?" Jack shrugged. "He's still here. That's something." She leaned against him. "What about you?" Jack hesitated. "Then I used to be afraid of the silence. Now I just don't want to waste it." The next morning they began assembling the rain catch system. Lena drew diagrams. Jack handled the barrels and pipe fittings. Eli even offered suggestions, mostly in grunts and nods. It was work, but it felt like more than that. It was claiming something permanent. While installing the final pipe, Jack slipped and cut his hand on a jagged metal edge. Blood smeared the barrel. Boone barked. Lena rushed to grab the first aid kit, but Eli beat her to it. He cleaned the wound without a word, wrapped it in gauze with practiced hands. Jack winced. "You ever patch yourself up this many times?" Eli gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Only the parts that mattered." That night they lit a small fire in the pit behind the cabin. Not for warmth, for memory. Jack pulled out a notebook, the one he'd started when the cabin was still a ruin, and all he had was a dog and silence. He handed it to Eli. The older man blinked at him. "What's this?" "It's everything I've learned since I got here." Eli hesitated, then took it, flipped to the last page, read the line written there in Jack's careful hand. "Some silences are prisons, but the ones you share, that's where healing begins." Eli stared at it for a long time, then almost inaudibly said, "Maybe it's time I wrote something down too." They sat in silence, not empty now, but full. Boone dozed beside the fire. Lena leaned against Jack's shoulder, and Eli, for the first time, didn't sit apart. In the distance, an owl called. Wind moved through the trees like a hush falling over a crowded room. Jack whispered to himself, almost without thinking, "I came here to disappear. But now, I'm becoming someone I never knew I could be." And in that silence, there was no fear. Only belonging. Only beginning. The ground was ready. After months of clearing, shaping, burning, rebuilding, and waiting, the soil was soft again, dark, rich, breathing. Jack stood beside the new greenhouse, bigger this time, stronger, framed in reclaimed iron and layered with glass panels Tommy had driven up one weekend without being asked. It shimmered in the morning light like something sacred, a promise finally honored. Boone circled his boot's tail, brushing the dirt nose, twitching at the bags of seeds. Lena stepped up beside him, carrying a wooden box she'd carved herself. Inside the seeds, sunflowers, beans, lettuce, lavender. All carefully labeled, all tucked into cloth pouches tied with string. "You ready?" she asked. Jack took a slow breath. "I think I've been ready since the first one burned down." Eli came up the path carrying a dented watering can. He didn't say anything, just nodded and handed it to Jack like passing a torch. They planted in silence, row by row, seed by seed. Jack sank his fingers into the soil and felt something settle in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that came from walking away, but the kind you earned by staying. The cabin had changed since the beginning. So had Jack. There was insulation now, a real pantry. A wind-powered radio tower Tommy helped install, short range but enough to get a weather report or call for help if needed. The second shelter was nearly done, framed and waiting for its roof. A sign of growth, of future. Inside the cabin above the desk was a photograph Lena had taken the day they broke ground on the rebuilt greenhouse. Jack, Boone, Lena, and Eli, all standing together covered in dirt and grinning like fools. The light behind them hit just right, like hope had photobombed the shot. Later that afternoon, they gathered near the fire pit for the first real meal from their own land. Squash stew, wild mushrooms, fresh herbs. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Jack poured hot tea into chipped mugs. Lena passed around a small loaf of bread. Boone circled the group, nosing for scraps. Eli stared into the flames. "It's strange," he said, finally watching something grow where so much was lost. Jack looked at him. "Maybe it takes that kind of loss to know how to build right." Eli nodded slowly. "Or maybe you just finally stopped running." Jack smiled. "I wasn't fast enough to outrun myself. Turns out that's a good thing." When the stars came out, Lena walked to the greenhouse alone. Jack followed a few minutes later, watching her from the doorway as she crouched beside the sunflower row, adjusting the soil with a small trowel. "These'll be tall by August," she said without turning. "Big enough to block the whole view if you stand in the wrong spot." "I like that," Jack replied. "A wall made of light." She looked up at him, her eyes soft. That's what you built here. You just didn't know it. Jack stepped closer, sat in the dirt beside her. I didn't build this alone. No, she agreed. But you chose to build it. That's what matters. He looked at his hands, scarred, rough, cracked with work. Once they'd only known how to grip the edge of failure. Now they could hold life. The next morning, Jack woke before dawn. He left the cabin quietly, Boone following close behind. At the edge of the ridge, he stopped and pulled the old envelope from his coat pocket. The one marked Melissa. The letter he'd never sent. It was faded now. Fragile. He crouched and buried it beneath the tallest sunflower seedling, covered it with earth, not to forget, but to feed something better. He whispered, "This is where I let go." Boone sat beside him, still and silent. The wind rose warm this time, gentle. When he returned to the cabin, Lena was making coffee. Eli sat by the window, carving something small from wood. Jack poured 3 mugs. No one said anything. They didn't need to. They knew. This was home now, not because of the walls, but because of the peeping inside them, because of the soil outside them, because they had chosen day after day to stay when it would have been easier to leave, to plant when it would have been easier to run, to believe in themselves, in each other, in the mountain, in what could grow from ruin. Later, Jack stood at the greenhouse again, watching the way the sun lit the glass in gold. Boone laid beside his feet. Lena leaned on the doorframe, sipping coffee. Eli was out back, setting traps not to catch, just to remind the mountain they still respected its rules. Jack whispered something to himself, something quiet, but real. We were broken things that chose not to stay broken. And from that choice came life. The mountain didn't forgive. It didn't forget. But it allowed. And that Jack had learned was enough.